Midway Atoll, June 1942. The Pacific War was about to be decided not by bombs or carriers, but by a lie sent through open airwaves. A single radio transmission, intentionally wrong, deliberately foolish, slipped past enemy ears and rewrote the map of the war. Before the first aircraft lifted from a carrier deck, the battle for Midway was already won in static. The vast emptiness surrounding Midway gave no hint of its importance. Two broken rings of coral and sand lay isolated in the central Pacific, exposed to wind, salt, and heat, defended by a thin garrison and aging aircraft operating at the edge of their mechanical limits. On a civilian map, it was a footnote. On a naval chart, it was a keystone. Whoever controlled Midway Atoll controlled the approach to Hawaii and the balance of power across half an ocean. By early June, the Pacific War had entered a phase defined not by territory, but by momentum. The Japanese Navy, fresh from a string of victories, was executing an operation designed to force a final, decisive engagement. Their carriers were already at sea, moving in disciplined formations, guided by fuel calculations, sortie schedules, and radio coordination refined through years of doctrine. Every movement was deliberate, every assumption reinforced by previous success. For the United States, the situation was precarious. Carrier strength was limited. Aircraft losses could not be easily replaced. A single misjudgment could cost what remained of the Pacific Fleet's striking power. Intelligence, therefore, became the decisive variable. Knowing where the enemy would strike mattered more than knowing how strong they were. Inside American intelligence centers, intercepted Japanese radio traffic flowed without pause. Streams of encrypted signals filled logbooks and analysis boards. Patterns emerged, frequencies, repetition, timing, but clarity remained elusive. One designation appeared repeatedly, anchoring entire operational messages. AF, fuel provisions, referenced AF, carrier movements aligned with AF. Timetables converged on AF, yet AF itself was undefined. Analysts suspected it referred to Midway, but suspicion was not proof. The Japanese were meticulous planners. They were capable of layered deception. If AF was a feint, committing carriers prematurely could invite disaster. If AF was Midway, and the Americans hesitated, the atoll would fall, and with it, the strategic initiative in the Pacific. Time compressed into hours, then minutes. Patrol aircraft searched vast expanses of empty water. Submarines reported fragments of sightings without context. Code breakers worked without rest, but full decryption lagged behind operational reality. The enemy was moving faster than mathematics. Amid this pressure, a different approach surfaced, one that bypassed encryption entirely. Instead of breaking Japanese codes, American intelligence would exploit Japanese belief in those codes. The plan required no bombs, no aircraft, no ships. It required a single radio transmission sent openly, deliberately flawed, and carefully designed to be intercepted. The message would sound mundane, even foolish. It would describe a logistical inconvenience rather than a military concern. And by reacting to it, the enemy would reveal what AF truly meant. Somewhere on Midway, a radio operator was about to transmit nonsense on purpose, unaware that the fate of fleets would hinge on whether the enemy took that nonsense seriously. By late May 1942, the Pacific War had settled into a dangerous rhythm. The Japanese combined fleet had not merely expanded across the ocean, it had imposed a psychological order on it. Every major engagement, since the opening months, had reinforced the same conclusion inside Tokyo's naval headquarters. Speed, coordination, and carrier aviation decided wars. Battleships were now escorts. Radio traffic was command itself. At the center of Japanese strategy stood Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, whose operational philosophy relied on drawing the remaining American carriers into a single annihilating engagement. Midway was not chosen for its size or defenses, but for its predictability. The Americans could not ignore a direct threat to the approaches of Hawaii. They would have to respond. That assumption underpinned the entire operation. The plan was complex, layered, and fragile. Carrier strike forces would advance from the northwest. A secondary force would move toward the Aleutians to divide attention. Submarines would form picket lines. Every element depended on timing measured in hours and fuel burn calculated to the ton. Coordination across thousands of miles required constant radio communication, an unavoidable necessity that Japanese planners accepted as manageable risk. What they underestimated was how much of that risk had already materialized. At Station High-Po in Pearl Harbor, American naval intelligence had been quietly reconstructing pieces of Japanese naval doctrine through partial code breaking. The code JN-25 was not fully penetrated, but it no longer needed to be. Analysts could identify ship groupings, infer operational tempo, and recognize when large-scale movements were underway. What they lacked was geographic certainty. The designation AF sat at the center of that uncertainty. It appeared in messages tied to fuel logistics, air group preparations, and fleet rendezvous points. The scale alone indicated a major objective, yet Japanese operational security ensured that AF was never spelled out. To commit American carriers without knowing its identity would risk walking directly into a trap. Strategically, the United States was operating from a position of weakness masked by urgency. Carrier losses from earlier battles had narrowed options. Aircraft inventories were thin. Pilot experience uneven. A wrong decision would not merely lose a battle, it could collapse American naval power in the Pacific entirely. This imbalance forced American intelligence into a rare position. Certainty mattered more than secrecy. They could not wait for perfect decryption. They needed the enemy to reveal intent indirectly. That necessity reframed radio traffic from something to be decoded into something to be provoked. If the Japanese reacted predictably to an unencrypted stimulus, they would confirm what encryption concealed. The coming battle would be decided not only by aircraft and carriers, but by whether information itself could be turned into a weapon, before the first bomb ever fell. Give me 9 minutes, and I'll improve. Once the transmission left Midway's antenna, the battle entered a phase where no one could stop it. Only misread it. Radio waves moved faster than fleets, and within hours, Japanese listening stations had logged the unencrypted American message describing a failure in freshwater production. On its surface, it was trivial. Islands failed, machinery broke. Garrison commanders complained. Nothing about it suggested urgency or deception. But intelligence never evaluates messages in isolation. Japanese analysts placed the transmission alongside encrypted operational traffic already under review. Patterns mattered more than content. Within that traffic, the designation AF continued to appear, now increasingly linked to logistics, scheduling, and contingency planning. When Japanese staff officers referenced water shortages associated with AF, the correlation was immediate and unintentional. A puzzle that had resisted cryptanalysis was solved through inference. For American intelligence, the confirmation arrived quietly but decisively. AF was not a feint. It was not Hawaii. It was not a diversion masked by distance. AF was Midway Atoll. With that single confirmation, abstract threat became fixed geography. Intelligence assessments hardened into operational orders. Carrier task forces that had been maneuvering cautiously now accelerated toward precise interception points. Fuel margins were recalculated. Launch windows narrowed. There would be no room for delay. Japanese forces, meanwhile, continued forward under the assumption of surprise. Their doctrine emphasized initiative and overwhelming first blows. They expected Midway to be neutralized quickly, its airfields silenced before American carriers could react effectively. The logic was sound. If the Americans were blind, they were not. As Japanese carrier groups advanced, radio traffic increased in density, coordination intensified. Each transmission reinforced the operational picture, already exposed by the deception. The Japanese believed they were controlling information. In reality, information was controlling them. American commanders now faced a different problem. Not uncertainty, but timing. Carrier aircraft operated at the limits of range and fuel endurance. Launch too early, and aircraft would miss the enemy. Launch too late, and the enemy would strike first. The window was narrow, defined by geometry, speed, and chance. Reconnaissance aircraft began to probe the edges of Japanese formations. Reports came back fragmented, bearing lines, smoke sightings, approximate distances. Each report shaved uncertainty down to minutes. The carriers adjusted course again. This was the moment when intelligence transitioned into combat reality. The battle was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding across hundreds of miles of ocean, invisible to those about to fight it. Pilots prepared aircraft without knowing the scale of what lay ahead. Deck crews worked with practiced speed. Commanders stared at maps that now, finally, made sense. The first physical contact between the opposing fleets was imminent, but the decisive advantage had already been established, carried not by aircraft or shells, but by a deliberately foolish message that the enemy had believed. "Give me 9 minutes, and I'll improve." By the time American carrier decks began turning into the wind, the battle had already narrowed to a series of unforgiving constraints: distance, fuel, time. There would be no second attempt. Aircraft launched now would either find the enemy or disappear into the Pacific with empty tanks. The intelligence advantage gained through deception did not guarantee victory. It only granted a chance, and that chance had to survive the physics of carrier warfare. American task forces were operating at the extreme edge of their reach. Carrier air groups were smaller than doctrine demanded, their pilots uneven in combat experience. Torpedo squadrons, flying obsolete aircraft, faced the heaviest burden. Dive bombers carried the decisive weapon, but only if they arrived at precisely the right moment. Minutes too early or too late would render the entire plan irrelevant. Japanese carrier groups, meanwhile, moved with confidence born of superiority. Their flight decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled, rearmed, and repositioned. Cycles overlapped. Timetables tightened. The very efficiency of their operation increased their vulnerability, compressing explosive potential into confined spaces. As American aircraft closed in, coordination began to fracture under stress. Torpedo squadrons attacked first, flying low and slow into layered defenses. Losses mounted rapidly. Aircraft were destroyed before reaching release range. Crews pressed on regardless, absorbing punishment without achieving immediate effect. Their attacks failed tactically, but succeeded strategically. Japanese combat air patrols were drawn downward, away from altitude. Defensive formations were disrupted. Ammunition was expended. Fuel was burned. Above this chaos, American dive bombers arrived unexpectedly, their approach masked by altitude, cloud, and timing that bordered on coincidence. What they found below was a fleet caught in transition, flight decks cluttered, hoses stretched, bombs stacked, aircraft exposed. The window was narrow. It would not reopen. Bombs struck with devastating effect. Explosions tore through hangar decks. Fires spread along fuel lines and ammunition stores. Damage control teams were overwhelmed almost instantly. Ships designed to project power became furnaces of steel and smoke. Within hours, the balance of the Pacific War shifted irreversibly. Yet none of this violence erased the fragile truth beneath it. Without prior certainty, the carriers would never have been in position. Without the confirmation of AF's identity, timing would have collapsed. The American attack depended on knowing where to gamble everything. At the breaking point of the battle, courage and chance carried the final weight. but intelligence had carried them to that point in the first place. The noise of combat drowned out radio traffic now. Signals no longer mattered. The decision had already been made. When the smoke thinned and the fires burned themselves out, the Pacific Ocean looked unchanged. The same empty horizon, the same relentless swell. But the war beneath that surface had shifted permanently. The Japanese Navy had lost carriers it could not replace, along with veteran air crews forged through years of expansion and early victories. The numerical losses were stark, but the qualitative damage was worse. Training pipelines could produce aircraft faster than experience. The imbalance would widen with every passing month. For the United States, the outcome reshaped strategic reality. The Pacific Fleet no longer fought to survive, it fought to advance. Midway marked the end of Japanese offensive momentum and the beginning of a long, grinding reversal that would stretch across island chains and years. Official after-action reports focused on aircraft performance, sortie timing, and command decisions. Dive bombing doctrine was refined. Carrier coordination improved. But inside intelligence circles, a quieter lesson carried equal weight. The battle had been enabled not by total code-breaking, but by behavioral prediction. The deception surrounding AF proved that an enemy did not need to be fully understood, only reliably anticipated. By feeding Japanese intelligence a believable, insignificant problem, American analysts had allowed the enemy to complete the analytical work themselves. It was not a failure of Japanese competence. It was a success of American insight. From that point forward, electronic warfare doctrine evolved. Signals were no longer just intercepted. They were shaped. Information became terrain. Silence, noise, and false clarity were all tools to be deployed deliberately. The radio operator who transmitted the meaningless message from Midway never appeared in victory headlines. He received no medals tied to dogfights or sinking ships. His action lasted minutes, vanished into static, and left no visible mark on the battlefield. Yet its effect echoed through fleet movements, launch orders, and lives saved or lost far beyond the range of any weapon. Midway's survival ensured that Hawaii remained secure, that American industry could mobilize without immediate threat, and that time, war's most precious resource, shifted sides. History often remembers wars through explosions and heroics. But Midway stands as a reminder that modern conflict is decided just as often by patience, inference, and restraint. Sometimes the most decisive act in war is not the loudest. Sometimes it is the message meant to be ignored and believed.